Okay, so last time we finished off talking about the structure of liability coverage for Part A here, and we talked about split limits. Remember, that first number is bodily injury per person. That's the most that we pay to anybody that you injure in thousands. Second number is bodily injury in total for the whole accident. And then the last number is for property damage liability. And these are per accident limits. So if you're unfortunate enough to get into 3 or 4 accidents, yeah, 3 or 4 times we could hit this limit. Of course, if that happens at the end of the policy period, usually 6 months for auto, you'll get a little letter that says, hey, we're not interested in being your auto insurance provider anymore. If you have 3, 4 accidents in 6 months, I would expect that. Remember, they cannot cancel a policy that's in force just because you have a lot of claims. That's not a valid reason to cancel. It's probably good enough to non-renew, although some states have limitations on non-renewals too. We'll talk about that in a little bit. I wanted to talk about, continuing with Part A, who is insured. So let me go ahead and make this, I guess actually that works out pretty good. We'll leave it at that. So who's actually insured? Well, the named insured is on the declarations, right? So clearly that person is an insured, no question. Automatically, anybody else who lives in your house is automatically insured. Resident family members are automatically insured. Also, anybody who you let borrow your car is insured under your policy. This is important. They're going to be primary when we do it that way. Insurance on the vehicle is primary. We'll get to that, but since it comes up here, I'll say it. So somebody uses your car with permission. They are an insured under your policy. Here is where it says that. So anybody who you let borrow your car has access to your limits, and it's primary. So if they get into an accident while they're driving your car, we're using your limits first. And usually in class, when I say that, I can see the wheels spinning in people's heads as they start to think about, well, maybe there's people that I shouldn't let drive my car. Yeah, you're going to want to know that. If they get into an accident, it's your insurance that's on the hook first because of this provision right here. They're an insured under your policy. Oh, and you say, oh, well, with permission. So if they get into an accident, I'll just say they didn't have permission. The way we interpret with permission means if you didn't file a police report because it was stolen, then they had permission to drive your car, right? How did they get the keys if they didn't have permission? Well, if you didn't report it stolen, then it's assumed that, yeah, you gave permission. So it's not easy enough to get out of that by saying, well, I didn't give permission. He's going to have to use his own insurance. Nope. If you let them use your car, they're covered under your policy and it's going to be primary. Nothing wrong with that, but you just want to know that ahead of time. These last two on here are a little tricky if you just read them. Okay, so it says any person or an organization is covered for liability arising from use of a covered auto on behalf of that person or organization. I find that kind of difficult to really kind of grasp just as written. I think that's kind of hard. It's better with an example. Let's say that I'm volunteering to help the Red Cross at an event, and they say, hey, Kevin, we need you to go pick up some supplies from a store. Okay, on my way to the store to pick up supplies for the Red Cross, I get into an accident, I hurt somebody else. That person says, hey, I'm going to sue the Red Cross. They're liable. They're the ones who asked you to go run that errand. A judge or a jury has to evaluate that claim. This is just saying, look, my insurance policy will step in and cover the Red Cross in that situation if somebody were to sue them because I was using the car for their benefit. That's what this is saying, that if I'm using the car for somebody else's benefit, we'll cover them if they should get sued. Kind of unlikely. And then this last part says the difference here is whether it's a covered auto is the first one up here. Down here it says doesn't have to be a covered auto, it can be any auto. So my friend and I are volunteering for the Red Cross. I use my friend's car to run an errand. My insurance will step in and cover the Red Cross if the Red Cross gets sued out of my use there. So fairly complicated, kind of hard to understand outside of an example. That's not something that I'm going to use on an exam. I think it's tricky enough with the straightforward coverages that we have. This one just is saying if you drive a car or your car on behalf of some other organization or some other person, if they get sued out of your actions, we'll step in and cover. Not something that's going to happen very often, but it is kind of interesting to see how broad who is insured. That's pretty broad. right? I mean, you could be forgiven for thinking, well, it's just going to be the person on the declarations. But yeah, it's that group. It's anybody who's a resident family member. It's anybody who I let drive my auto. And then it's anybody else who happens to get sued because of my use of my auto or someone else's auto. So it's pretty broad. A lot of different possibilities over how other people can be insured under my policy. Okay, so we have liability coverage. We've already talked about that up to the stated limits. Could be a split limit, that's most common, or it could be a single limit. So we might separate out how much for bodily injury per person, how much for bodily injury in total, how much for property damage. We might do it that way, or we might just have a single limit that says we're going to give you $200,000 in coverage, and we don't care how many people you hurt, whether it's property damage or bodily injury, just $200,000 per accident. That's your limit. That's a lot simpler, but it's not the most common, which is interesting. So you'll have liability coverage in Part A all the way up to whatever limits you purchase, you choose. There are state minimums, and we'll talk about that in the Auto Insurance and Society chapter that's coming up. But I've already given you my opinion on if you have state minimum limits, I think that you are radically underinsured. It's okay for you to make your decisions and go forward, but that's something that you want to know, I think, is that state minimum limits relatively are low. That creates some problems that we'll discuss in that later chapter. So another coverage that's in here is up to $250 for the cost of a bail bond. Okay, so some of you might not, let's start with bail bonds. Some of you might not know what a bail bond is. The idea is if you are accused of a crime, then we have to try to come up with a way to make sure that you're going to answer for that and that you're going to show up in court. One way to do that is to jail you until the court date. And for serious crimes, that's what we're going to do. We're going to hold you in jail and deprive you of your freedom and make you show up for your court date. If you want to get out of jail in the meantime, normally what you have to do is you have to post bail. And that's a certain dollar amount of money set by a judge that if you want to get out of jail, you have to put up this amount of money. And then if you show up, you get it back. If you don't show up, you forfeit the money. And then you'll have a warrant issued for your arrest, and they'll come looking for you. And at some point, they'll take you and force you to answer for whatever crime you've been accused of here. So what can happen where this comes up with auto is that sometimes there are auto offenses in a different state. So let's say I'm driving, on a cross-country trip, and I'm in Arizona, coming back from the Grand Canyon, right? We take a detour through the desert, want to drive through there. I'm driving too fast. I'm driving way too fast. Let's say I'm driving 30 miles an hour over the speed limit. Their speed limit's 70. I'm going 100. Okay, well, I'm going to get pulled over, and they may not just issue me a ticket and trust that I'm going to pay. They may say, look, this is reckless driving. We're taking you to jail. Whoa. Okay, and now I'm out of state. What we're going to have to do then to get out of jail is I got to post a certain amount of money. They might say, hey, you need $5,000 cash if you want to get out and wait for your court date. But I don't have $5,000 in cash. Most people don't. So the way this works is there are companies out there, bail bonds companies, that what they do is they say, okay, for a cost, usually 5 or 10% of the bond, something like that, we'll put up the $5,000, but you got to pay us 5% of that amount right now today. And I say, okay, well, I got $250. Here you go. You pay my $5,000 bond, and then I promise to show up in court. Now, if I don't, now it's the bail bonds company, whoever issued the bail bond, they're the ones who lose the money. And so they're going to come looking for me. If you remember the show that was Dog the Bounty Hunter, that's what he's doing. He works for a bail bonds company. It might be his own company. And he's chasing down people who've skipped out on their promise to show up for court. Okay, so big idea. Pack that back up and say, okay, well, where does that come in for insurance? They will give you up to $250 for the cost of a bail bond. And in auto, that's probably how it's likely to happen if it happens. You'll get pulled over in some other states, and they will want to hold you to make sure that you show up for court. If you want to get out of jail, you got to have money to post a bail bond. You'll probably have to pay a bail bondsman to do that. This $250 goes to help pay the cost of them putting up the bond for you. So it's kind of neat to know that you have a little bit of coverage there. Now, this isn't going to cover for something serious, right? I mean, if you get accused of murder, a lot of times there's no bail at all. And if there is, it might be 500,000 or $1 million. I mean, it's a huge amount of money. And yeah, you're probably going to have to use a bail bondsman to come up with that money. But even 5% of that is going to be a big chunk of money. And you only got $250 to pay for that under here. So this isn't going to pay if you've done something really, really serious. It's just not going to be enough. But it is nice to know you have a little bit of coverage there if you need it. Something unusual happens and you find yourself jailed and you need to post bond to get out. On a different side, moving on to this third additional coverage here, you get up to $200 a day if you need to assist the insurance company. So I've caused an auto accident. I've been sued. The insurance company needs my help. They might need me to give a deposition under oath. I'm being videotaped and they're asking me questions I have to answer under oath. That's going to take time. And if it takes time away from my job and I lose earnings because of it, this is where they say we'll compensate you for your lost earnings with a maximum of $200 a day. They don't give you $200 a day. They pay you what you can demonstrate you've lost. So if I make $12 an hour and I missed an 8-hour day, that's $96. That's what they'll pay me. And if I make more than that, great, whatever it is, but they're not paying me more than $200 a day to help them. And that's a condition of the policy. I have to agree to help them if I want auto coverage to happen. So maybe they need a deposition. Maybe they need me to testify at court. We talked about this in the homeowners unit. Incidentally, in the homeowners, they'll give you up to $250 a day. I don't know why the difference. In auto, it's up to $200. Again, that's a minor thing. I wouldn't put that on an exam. But it is nice to know that you do have to comply with what they need for assistance, but if it causes you to miss time from work, they will compensate you for that in the auto policy up to $200 a day. So it's nice to know. And then other reasonable expenses that go along with it. So you'll have some meals, you'll have mileage, maybe. Whatever it costs you to assist the insurance company, they will cover the cost of you doing that. You just have to agree to do it. And so those are some additional things that show up with Part A. Then we've got exclusions to talk about. Here we've got exclusions that show up for each part. So A, B, C, and D, you'll see exclusions. The nice thing is there isn't a whole lot of difference between them, and you'll see that. When we talk about the Part A exclusions, intentional injury, not a surprise. Anything intentional is always excluded. So if it can be proven that I deliberately damaged somebody else's property or deliberately hurt them with my automobile, then my auto insurance isn't going to cover. That's a tough thing to prove. But if it can be proven that I hurt somebody on purpose, then yeah, it won't be covered. Any property that I own, or if I rent it or borrow it or I'm transporting it for somebody else, when it's in my care, custody, and control, we consider it mine. So if you think about this, this is liability, Part A, right? So that's not going to pay for my property because liability never covers first-party losses. Right? I can't sue myself. That doesn't make any sense. So if we're in an accident and I damage other people's property, yeah, that's covered. My property that gets damaged, this isn't where we get help for that. Not under Part A because that's liability. That's a third-party coverage. That's only paying other people. Bodily injury to an employee. This is a common exclusion in insurance contracts for a reason that might be obvious and probably is obvious if you own a business. Outside of that, you probably haven't thought about that. Your employees are supposed to be covered under workers' compensation. So I go into our small business, I drive my car, somehow I damage my employee, I hit my employee. My personal auto coverage isn't going to handle that because we're expecting that any injury on the job is handled by workers' compensation. So this exclusion is just in here to make sure that we don't pay people twice, right? That violates principle of indemnity. You have all kinds of moral hazard problems when you pay people twice for one incident. So we're only going to pay you once, and the way that we're going to pay you is through workers' compensation, not auto insurance. That's why employees are going to be excluded. And for most people, you don't have any employees, right? Most people don't have employees, so they're not going to have to worry about this exclusion. That's not something that's going to come up for most people. This is a big one, the use as a conveyance. In other words, if you're taking people, you're transporting people for money, or you're transporting property for money, then your vehicle is being used as a conveyance. And we call this the cab exclusion. If you're actually using your car as a taxi cab, So yeah, think about the Uber and the Lyft and stuff like that. Your personal auto policy, this is a standard policy that we're looking at. It's called the personal auto policy. That's going to exclude taking people from place to place for money, or transporting property from one place to another for money. That's when you're operating your vehicle that way, that's a completely different kind of use. And you need a completely different type of insurance coverage. A lot of times you can endorse that back on. And if I'm not mistaken, I haven't done Uber or Lyft myself, but my understanding is they're providing insurance somehow. You're going to want to be clear on that before you agree to enter an arrangement where you're taking people around for money, because your personal auto policy probably has that excluded. Now, this is the standard policy. I can't tell you what State Farm says or Liberty Mutual says or Nationwide says. I don't know. Okay, so you need to protect yourself. If you're bringing people around with Uber or Lyft, or you're doing Uber Eats, whatever, this says it's going to be excluded. You're going to want to know if your personal auto policy excludes that too. If it's the standard policy, I can tell you it is excluded. But if it's not, maybe it's covered, maybe it's not. And it's worth a conversation with your agent to make sure that you've got coverage here in that situation. Okay, vehicles with fewer than 4 wheels. Think about that one. We're probably talking about what? Yeah, motorcycle. So motorcycle is not covered in your auto policy. We've got motorcycle policies. It's a fairly simple thing to do. And the interesting thing about motorcycles, you think about it, the problem isn't liability, right? Because if you have a car versus a motorcycle accident, it's usually the motorcycle that comes off worst. So the liability piece of that is usually not terribly expensive relative to the auto, because the auto can do more damage, right? The collision piece is usually fairly expensive, because if you get into an accident and you're on a motorcycle, as far as the property is concerned, you're going to be at a disadvantage most likely. So the collision piece is usually the expensive part of motorcycle coverage. Either way, it's excluded in the auto policy, and you need to know that. Also, vehicles not designed for public roads are excluded in the auto policy. So if you've got something like a golf cart, or if you got something like a riding lawnmower, your auto policy isn't going to help you out here for liability. Interestingly enough, those might be covered in your homeowner's policy. So again, you have these kinds of special vehicles, 4-wheelers, something like that. You need to check with your insurance agent and make sure you've got proper coverage, because some policies will exclude them both on the homeowners and the auto. For sure, they're excluded on the auto. They want you to insure those things separately. Auto is not designed for that. The second to last one here, the vehicle other than a covered auto made available for your regular use. That's just making sure that people are paying appropriate premiums, right? Because we said you are covered. Anybody is covered if they're driving one of your vehicles, right? You're also covered in any vehicle that you drive as a temporary substitute vehicle. Well, here's where we're kind of clarifying what that temporary substitute means. If it's a vehicle that's made available for your regular use, it's got to show up on a declarations page and be specifically named, because we're trying to make sure that you're paying premium, right? So we're trying to get away, they've already outthought you. People are like, wait a minute, what if I have, 4 cars in my family and I only insure one, and then I just call all the others temporary substitute vehicles? Then, I've only paid one premium, but I'm covered no matter what I'm driving. Here's where you're going to lose coverage, because they're going to say if something is made available for your regular use and it's not a covered auto, then you're not going to be covered here. Now, it's not further defined, so it's hard to know. All right, I drive, so my roommate has 2 cars. He insures one, and just the other one is just hanging around. I'm driving that thing. Well, all right, if it's something where you drove it, twice in 6 months, that sounds like a temporary substitute vehicle. You're probably fine. If you're driving that thing every day to work, pretty clear that's made available for your regular use, and it would probably be excluded under your roommate's auto policy for the other car. So we're just trying to make sure that people have coverage listed appropriately. If you're using a car regularly, it needs to be on your declarations page. Yeah, temporary substitute stuff, don't worry about it. If it's a once in a blue moon kind of thing, that's pretty clearly covered. But if you're regularly using an auto that is not on your declarations page, that's a red flag. You want to be careful, because here's where that exclusion can burn you. Again, your agent is your friend here. Give them your situation, and they will help you build the appropriate coverage to make sure that you're all right. Don't play games and try to outwit them. Insurance companies have seen it all, and they've thought about all these possibilities. They've written their policies in a way that you're not going to get one over on them. So don't try, is my advice. Just be honest and get the appropriate coverage. Last exclusion, vehicle that's located in a racing facility. That's an exclusion. So yeah, the way the personal auto policy is written, it's possible that if you didn't have this last exclusion, that it would sound like maybe the people who are actually physically involved in racing should be covered if they have accidents. This is saying, look, if that's what you're doing, we need coverage coming from a different area. That's not typical use. So we're going to exclude that here. Okay, that's another good place to stop here and take a break before we move on to the next one. So thanks a lot. We'll go from there. If you have questions, email. Always happy to answer and try to do the best I can to make sure that this makes sense. So thanks, guys. We'll go from there.